And the red light's on, and we are rolling with Richard Marsh. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it so much.
You're welcome.
I found out about you from my friend Henrietta, who's also one of my clients, and I just love her. And she exposed me to Cheryl Hope and the Get a Life podcast. You even have the T-shirt on right now. And so we've had Cheryl and Carmen on the show. It was absolutely wonderful. I've learned so much, and I've just learned so much about cults. And I really do believe that it is important that we know the enemy. And I think it's really awesome that you were able to get out of such an extreme example of a cult, but then also to be able to kind of track a lot of the information and share things. I've been watching videos of you today, and I was blown away because you were on Blackballed, another great podcast.
Yeah.
And you're starting out talking, and you're like, yeah, they're the Plymouth Brethren. We're going to go into Barrington. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's where I'm from. I mean, what are the chances? It's a small town outside northwest of Chicago. And so I was like, and you're right, it's very, very wealthy. I grew up with friends that, oh my gosh, the money they had and the families that they were connected to. So they were trying to sneak in there. Did they get it?
No, it's all tied up in great big legal tangles. I think the residents and the council there have realized. I mean, it's funny because they're beating the brethren at their own game, because when the brethren are taken to court, they're experts at delaying everything and kicking it down the road, and now they're getting a dose of their own medicine. So yeah, they'll probably get their permission, but it might take about another 50 years or so. So
oh my gosh,
yeah, we're happy with the results so far.
Well, good.
The only people who are really benefiting are the lawyers at this point.
And that's the way it always is, right? And the judges, because a lot of the I don't know if you're from Canada, or you live in Canada, or where?
I live in Canada. I was born in England. Yeah.
So in the U.S., a lot of the courts are privately owned, and people literally don't believe me when I tell them that. And I'm like, go look it up on Dun and Bradstreet.
Wow.
They're listed as a business. Yeah, it's crazy. So there's a lot that people need to become aware of. And I'm excited to share just a little bit of your story, but then also to really get into the roots of how it all began, and a little bit of where eschatology came from, and the Scofield Bible, and all the stuff that you're kind of the expert on from that cult view.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, when I kind of did a bit of research and background on there's so much just to outline the most basic history that I don't think we'll have time on this podcast for too much of my own story. But just to kind of say where I came from, I was born into this cult, 4th generation, in Cambridge in the UK. Escaped at the age of 46. Left my wife and 5 children in the cult, and as it is with the brethren, haven't seen or heard anything of them since. Built myself a new life from scratch. I mean, when I left, I didn't have any money apart from anything else. So 10 years on, I've happily remarried. I went to Jamaica, married a Jamaican girl. We got a lovely 2-year-old daughter. Aww. So I'm in a good place now, but the journey was, of course, very traumatic. And I mean, I just want to point up the podcast you did with Beth Seed.
Oh, she did such a great job.
Which does a brilliant job of explaining what it's like inside the exclusive brethren, or Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, as they're now called today. So yeah, these everyone who comes out of that system passes through huge trauma, and it and it leaves scars. So
well, they strip you of your identity, which is definitely one of Satan's favorite tricks to do. And when they take away your family and your children, they're taking away literal pieces of your heart.
Yes. And I mean, in addition to taking away your family and your children and all the friends and people you've ever known. You're also losing your house and your job. So you really are out on your ear with nothing. And of course, that kind of behavior didn't just appear in a vacuum. It developed actually from some of the very early days of the cult. And that's what I really want to talk about, is where the Brethren movement came from and what influence it has, where it's got to, and also the influence it's had on the world as a whole, which is actually quite substantial, particularly in the USA.
Go ahead. I'm sorry that you were
I was
done.
going to say, when I left, and I mean, if you imagine you've lived in a cult the whole of your life, you've never known something different, and you finally get out and you look back and you say, why did this happen? What was this all about? Because it all seems irrational once you understand it. And so that's why I started to dig in and look into the history. I mean, when I was in the Brethren, I was interested in Darby from a Brethren perspective, because I thought if I read through his works, I'll find all the answers to all my questions. So I kind of knew the literature quite well. But when I got out,
you say Darby, for people who don't know, that's the founding father of the Plymouth Brethren, just the Plymouth Brethren, but there's been so many offshoots since then, correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And we can really only trace, one line up the family tree, and that's the line that starts with J.N. Darby and ends at what's now called the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. But keep in mind that it is a tree, and we're only going up one branch and ending at one twig, even though it's definitely the most notorious and unpleasant twig.
Oh, is
a lot
it
of
the
the other
worst
branches
of all
are
of
quite
them?
benign, really.
Do you think it's the worst of all of them?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
There's no
wow.
comparison. I mean, there's no. Most of the rest of there's probably 2.5 million total people who can trace their church affiliation back to J.N. Darby, more or less, and the vast majority of those are, fairly fundamentalist, but also very outgoing Christians who, support missions to Africa and help out in the local food bank, and are genuinely nice people, even if they're a little old-fashioned.
Right.
But the PBCC is another animal altogether. I mean, Darby wouldn't acknowledge or recognize them. He would be horrified if he realized what his legacy had become.
Wow. And it's interesting too, because our friend Henrietta was telling me that she was doing, research into the history, because I've been asking her about it. And she was telling me that the Plymouth Brethren, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Latter-day Saints, and Mormons all started at around the same 20 to 30 year period, which is very interesting. And they all began, I think, in Europe, right?
I'm not sure on the details. Certainly the Mormons were very exactly contemporary with J.N. Darby. They literally started the Brethren and the Mormons started. The Book of Mormon was published the year the Brethren started, so that was very close. The others officially came into being, I think, the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses started later, but in fact, the predecessors of those movements were contemporary. So they only took their modern names maybe 50 or 60 years later. But if you trace back the doctrine, it does indeed all start from the same period. And I mean, that's really where I was going to start, was to say, why at this moment in history did all this, after years of stability, when there was the Church of England and there was the Roman Catholic Church and there was the Presbyterians and Methodists, why did all this new stuff start happening? And so we're talking about J.N. Darby, who's born in 1800, so 225 years ago, and the Brethren movement started when Darby was in his 20s. So we talk about 1820 in England, and it was a really heady time and disturbing time in the history of the world, because they just had the French Revolution, what was it, 1780s, 1790s, and just had the American Revolution. And the French Revolution particularly was a very secular, in fact, in some ways, atheist revolution. And the whole concept of democracy was emerging. Now, to explain that, England at that period was, or the UK, in fact, the British Empire, was all run and controlled by what we would now call oligarchs.
Right.
It was landowners. The only people who had the right to vote were landowners, and in practice, all the power belonged to the big landowners. And I mean, are you familiar with Downton Abbey and all those period things? It's the world of Downton Abbey. So you've got these big landowners who would have a big grand house or a castle, lots of servants, and then they would own vast areas of land, and they'd have tenant farmers. And so the farmers, the ordinary people, didn't own anything. They just had to pay their rent. And that the whole of England was run by these sort of Downton Abbey-esque characters in their castles and grand homes dotted all across the country. And it was also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so there were starting to be wealthy merchants who were gaining power. But the disparity between the rich and poor was very, very extreme. It wasn't as nice and cozy as Downton Abbey. The poor people, it was like Charles Dickens' world, extreme poverty. The poor were very poor, and a very tiny percentage of the people were extremely rich, and there was very little in between. Now, Darby was born in right in the middle of London, in Westminster, which is where the Houses of Parliament are, and it was the height of the British Empire. So he was at like the very centre of world power at that time, which of course is a fantastic place if you're starting a new religion. So born in Westminster, and as you probably realise from Downton Abbey, the aristocracy at that time were extremely poor at parenting. They basically farmed their kids out to other people to raise, and so poor Darby, he was the sixth son of an extremely wealthy aristocratic family. His mother disappeared mysteriously. There's some scandal about it, but she was banished from the house when he was extremely young, and he barely remembers her. And he was sent off to a boarding school where, you sleep there, you stay there all the time.
Right.
Also in Westminster, it was only 15 minutes walk from his house, but he didn't go home to go to bed. He was boarded out in this school, which is probably fairly typical of the aristocracy, but he really had this very loveless childhood.
Yeah, it sounds horrible.
He was very, he came from a very privileged family. He had everything materially he could possibly want, but his family was, it comes over as extremely cold. So he's a very brilliant child. He graduates from school. He goes to university in Dublin, in Ireland. And the reason for that is that the Darby family's seat, their big castle, literally castle, was actually right in the middle of Ireland. It's called Leek Castle, and it's extremely haunted. It's the most haunted building in Ireland. It's got all sorts of terrifying ghosts, apparently, if you believe in that stuff.
Wow.
But his branch of the family, like his father lived in London, that's where he was born, but his uncle, I think, lived in the family castle in the middle of Ireland. And Ireland at that point was the poorest country in Europe. It was full of these peasant farmers who literally lived in mud huts. And at that point, the Irish were Catholic. And of course, the English and the British Empire was all Church of England Protestant. And the British or the English strictly, had invaded Ireland and were ruling it as a colony. And so the landlords in Ireland were a very rich collection of aristocrats who were Protestant, and they were known as the Protestant Ascendancy because they were ascendant over the poor Irish, who were these extremely poor peasants, but who actually collectively, through their thousands of tiny small holdings, enabled this 1% to be extremely rich. So it was a very bitter situation. It's a little bit like Israel and Palestine, in the sense that the people who were controlling and running the place were a different religion
Right.
to the people who were, at the grassroots and who were being oppressed. So it added quite apart from the class distinction, there was a very deep religious bitterness between the Protestants who ran the place and the extremely poor Catholics who were despised. So Darby had a lot of family in Ireland, so hence he goes to Dublin to university, Trinity College, gets a gold medal in classics, which is like Latin and Greek and so on, studies to be a barrister, gets very good. He was kind of tipped to be the next sort of Attorney General of Ireland, apparently. He's obviously got a very great, a very good score on his legal exam. And then, to much to the horror of his family, he gets religion and disappears to a tiny backwater of Ireland, Callery, I think it's called. Let me just check my notes.
Oh yeah, take your time. Thank you so much for this. I really think that it is so important that people understand the roots, because
definitely.
And so, in your words, before you keep going, why do you think it's important that people understand this, the genesis of it?
Well, because there's a moral reason for the way it's. There's a moral reason why it is how it is now, and if you can understand how it got there, then you can avoid it happening again. If you don't understand why it is like it is,
right,
then history will repeat itself by definition.
Yeah.
So, it's too late. We can't exactly save the PBCC now, but there's new religions and new sects and church divisions happening all the time, and there are certain lessons you could learn from this that would give you some judgment as to some early warning, shall we say, that things are going off the rails.
Exactly. And even the way that one person can interpret something, and with charm and power are able to coerce people into agreement. And that's what's so crazy to me about the way this particular one, yours, is so almost hypnotic in the way that they stay on you guys every single day, and it's always the same. It's like,
oh yeah.
I don't know. I'm actually amazed anyone like you or Beth Seed or Cheryl could even get out. Like, it's a miracle.
Well, it is. Yeah, it's extremely hard to get out. So yeah, no, it was Callery was the little town, but the Irish county was Wicklow, which is extremely mountainous, and it's well away from the kind of English influence. So this is a really wild, poverty-stricken area of Ireland, and he joins the Church of Ireland, which was part of the Church of England, as a curate, which is kind of the bottom level of the clergy, and he goes out traveling around the Irish peasants up in the mountains. It's appallingly wet and rocky country, and no roads, it's just mud and moorland and bogs. And he was very successful in converting them. And we have to kind of qualify that by saying he wasn't converting them to Christianity, he was converting them from Catholics to Protestants. And so that was all part actually of a kind of a political movement, because the British government realized that if you could convert all these Catholics into Protestants, there would be much less antagonism. It would make for more peaceful conditions, because the Irish were always about to rebel. They were notoriously feisty people. So it was to some extent a political movement to try and convert the Irish to Protestantism, and that way exercise control over them. So he did this for 2 years, and then and I think his family were quite distressed about it. It wasn't where they envisaged his career going. It was quite an act of rebellion on his part, you might say. Though I do wonder whether possibly there might have been some feeling of guilt about where his family wealth had come from. I don't know. It just crosses my mind. That could have been one of his motives for actually going out and seeing these people that, But while those particular people weren't his tenants, his family would have had thousands of similar peasant tenants in their own patch of Ireland. Anyway, 2 years pass by, and he's thrown from his horse somewhere in the wilds of Ireland and is very badly injured. I think he hit a doorpost or something and smashed his face up and injured himself really badly. He was taken back to recuperate, convalesce at his sister's house in Dublin, and he was really, really sick. And it was during this period of trying to recover from this head injury and everything else that he started to have these, an epiphany, if you want to use the word. He had all this time just sort of lie there in the dark and think about things. And he, this is where his whole dispensationalism ideas started coming together in his head.
Okay, so for people that don't know what dispensationalism, because I was one of them just recently, can you share with people what that is?
Yes. So dispensationalism is a way of interpreting the Bible, which is, it simply says that the Bible is broken up into distinct eras or dispensations, and different rules apply in those different dispensations. So, I mean, the most obvious one that everyone, is agreed by all churches is, well, the Old Testament is a different dispensation to the New Testament.
Right.
So you can't just start stoning adulterers because it said so in Leviticus, because we're actually, the law changed.
But you can tithe.
Well, people are very selective about where they.
Yeah, we don't want to wear the things on our heads when we go to church, but we do want you to tithe.
But this is a much more detailed breakdown. It says, well, there's one dispensation for Adam and Eve where the rule was, have fun but don't eat the apples. And then there's another dispensation between, being kicked out of paradise and the flood, and another dispensation to Babel. So it's all kind of common sense and not terribly controversial until you get to the end of the dispensations, which is Book of Revelation, essentially. And so what all the major churches believed up to this point was that in the current time, we call it Anno Domini, year of our Lord, present dispensation since the year naught, the church was going to increase and spread, and it would spread around the globe, and lots of people would be converted, and there would be, some people who resisted that. And then at some unspecified time, when the world had, most of the world had been converted to Christianity, and a lot of the Jews had been converted to Christianity, then the Lord would come in person and reign personally in Jerusalem. And, then you enter on to, then there's the judgment of the people who had refused the gospel. And of course, at the point when the British Empire was expanding and spreading the gospel to all these, non-Christian races in Africa and India and all around the world, that seemed a very reasonable picture, because you could see that Christianity was expanding. You could see that people were coming into Christianity. But then, as I mentioned before, you have and it's all very stable, because the aristocracy are in control of everything, all around the European countries. You've got this stable system, and it was regarded as God's order. God's at the top, and then you've got the monarchy and the aristocracy who control everything. And it's a class system, and all those classes must stay in order. And something like someone from a working class sort of jumping up and behaving like an aristocrat, that was an offense to God. You were disrupting God's order. And then you get the French Revolution, where, absolutely that happened. The working people took over and put everyone else through the guillotine. And then you have the American Revolution, which was similar in some ways, in that it was regular, ordinary people who took control of their own country and throughout the monarchy and the interference. And suddenly that rosy picture of the world was suddenly looked very threatened. And at the same time, democracy was making great strides in England, and there was lots of talk about letting regular people vote. Well, at least men, not women, of course. But letting ordinary people vote, and that terrified. I mean, the word democracy in 1820 was as scary as the word dictator is today. They thought that if this happened, it would be chaos and all hell would break loose. So dispensationalism, and this is the great. This is the huge stark change that Darby's dispensationalism brought in. Darby said, no, Christianity isn't going to go on and spread and it's all going to be lovely. He said the prophecies in the book of Revelation haven't happened yet. They're all going to happen. Because the view at that time with Christianity spreading is that those all those terrible things that happen in Revelation, all the plagues that are poured on the earth, and all the distress and the trouble, that was back in the 1st and 2nd century when the Romans were persecuting the church. That had all happened. We're past that really dangerous stage, and all that's left for us is to just keep on doing our good stuff. And because the empire was kind of still spreading slowly, it was obviously going to be several generations before the Lord was going to return. So there was no urgency. We just keep doing this good stuff, and we're going to die in our beds. We're not going to die with our boots on. Darby turns all that on its head and says, no, he says, the political world, the governments of the world are going to fall. They're already heading for chaos with this terrible democracy thing. And he said, the churches are ruined. He said let me check my note here. So under Darby's interpretation of Revelation, the Catholic Church was the great harlot, Babylon, the great harlot, mother of harlots. And the Protestant Church, he connected it with Laodicea, which is one of the churches in the beginning of Revelation, and the addresses to the 7 churches. And he says, so there's Revelation 3, to the angel of the assembly in Laodicea write, these things says the Amen, the faithful and true witness. I know thy works, thou art neither hot nor cold. I would that thou wert cold or hot. Thus, because thou art lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I'm about to spew thee out of my mouth. So Darby damned all the existing churches in one shot. Because, I mean, you're either Catholic or Protestant. The Catholics were the great harlot, and the Protestants were about to be spewed out of God's mouth. The governments of the world were about to fall. The Great Tribulation was about to come on the earth, and there was going to be this huge destruction. And I mean, this is what we were brought up to believe, and what a lot of Christians in the Bible Belt, evangelicals, are brought up to believe. And we all thought that this was what the Bible said. We never even knew there was another interpretation.
Right.
But before Darby came off his horse, no one thought this. I mean, some of these ideas were floating around in obscure places, but he was the first one to put it all together and give a complete alternative interpretation of biblical prophecy. And it went from being this nice, warm and fuzzy thing that everything's going smoothly and don't worry about it, to enormous disaster is coming. And unless you do something dramatic, you're going to go down with the boat. So this was, and think this wasn't a very secular world. I mean, everyone belonged to some denomination in those years. And so this was really radical, and it was really controversial. And so this raises the question, well, what are we supposed to do? If the Protestants were all bad and the Catholics were all bad, what hope is there for us? And of course, Darby, this is where the next strand of Darby and Brethrenism comes in. At the same time as Darby was convalescing, there were Christians gathering together privately in a room in Dublin, who came together on a non-denominational basis. I mean, they said, I think it was a guy called Cronin, who said, you don't need a clergyman or a church to be a Christian and to hold communion. So these were various Christians from various backgrounds, and they came together every Sunday and they broke a loaf of bread and they had the wine and they talked about the scriptures. And although it doesn't sound very exciting, it was a completely radical idea at the time that they weren't any part of any denomination, because all the churches and everything was corrupt and bad. They were coming out from the denominations and going back to basics, and they kind of felt that they were just doing what it said in the Bible, and that therefore they were kind of back to the early church as it's described in the book of Acts. And Darby, when he recovered, he joins with these people, and they had a scripture that they based their position on, which was let me just quote it accurately. It is hang on, let me find it.
No hurry.
So it's Matthew 23, but be not ye called rabbi or teacher, for one is your master, even Christ, and all ye are brethren. So the idea was they didn't have any clergyman or leader. They were all equal. I think the idea is also being called the priesthood of all believers, that everyone who's a believer is equal, and Christ is the head of the church in heaven. And that if you put someone between the believer and Christ, like a clergyman or any kind of official like that, that's offensive and that's wrong. So it was kind of ironically an ultra democratic idea. And so Darby didn't invent this. He joined in with this, and he linked together his idea of, how everything was basically going to be destroyed with this concept of, well, there's this space that's outside of all Christendom and outside of world government and outside of political influence. Because, the Church of England was run by the government. It was essentially a government organization. So it's separate from all that. And he linked that with the address to the Church of Philadelphia, which is, one of the other 7 churches.
Yep.
And let me just find that quote. So to the address to the assembly in Philadelphia says, because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I also will keep thee out of the hour of trial, which is about to come upon the whole habitable world, to try them that dwell on the earth. So Darby's interpretation of Revelation was that just before the hour of trial, just before these disastrous things happen and everything collapsed, the Lord would return and take up to heaven the saints, though the people that were right, so to speak.
The ones that he says are right.
Yeah, they would be kept out of the hour of trial, and everyone else would have to, everyone else would perish in all the stuff we know about with the plagues and the nukes and everything else. So this was completely different from everyone else's interpretation up to the time. There was no idea, no sense that the Lord was going to come twice. First come to take, the Christians out of the trial, and then come again to reign some years later, which is Darby's interpretation. No, the old interpretation was everything kind of goes on smoothly, and then when everything's lovely, the Lord comes when it's all nice and ready for him, when everything's ready. It's a very radical difference.
It's a huge difference when you think about it. I mean,
night and day.
Yeah. And I would think that one of them is more inspiring to see the whole world be wonderful, and the other one is more fear-based and, hurry up and be a part of our group so that you can be one of the first to not be left behind, so to speak.
Oh, profoundly. I mean, if you're an optimist, you go for one. If you're a pessimist, you go for the other. And of course, and what we find is through the history since, when there's a war or a major disaster, everyone's inclining towards, well, this is end times. And when things are looking a little bit better, people are, oh, well, the Lord's not coming, and let's get on and evangelize and convert people around the world. There was the third strand. So we got two. I kind of put down there's 3 strands to Plymouth Brethrenism. The first is like the church governance, this completely flat church structure with no clergyman or anything. The second is dispensationalism, and in particular, the end of that. The first part of dispensationalism isn't exciting. It's the eschatology, it's the end times thing that's really radically different. And the third thing, and this is what comes in now, is doctrine of separation, which is one of the things that causes all the grief to, us poor guys who were born into this. So Darby, because of his sort of intellectual brilliance, quickly takes leadership of this group of otherwise very ordinary Christians who were just doing a little quiet thing on their own. And he over the period of 5-10 years, he develops his doctrine of separation. And this is based on 2 Timothy 2. The Lord knows those that are his, and let everyone who names the name of the Lord withdraw from iniquity. Well, I mean, that's kind of obvious. If you're a Christian, then you don't get mixed up in sin. But the problem is that Darby interpreted withdraw from iniquity. It was withdrawing from people,
the world
had sin or were connected with sin, not withdrawing from the sin itself. And he regarded sin as an infectious disease. So his attitude was very like the COVID bubbles, that you can only associate with a limited number of people, and you can't have anyone in that group who is also associating with someone outside that group, because otherwise it's like drilling a hole in a submarine. Even if it's only a small hole, it's going to fill up with water, because sin transmits, doesn't matter how many people distant it is, doesn't matter how many righteous people there are between you and the sinner. If you share a cup of, if someone at the end of the chain shares a cup of tea with a sinner, they're having fellowship with them, and then it transmits all the way up the chain, and everyone is contaminated.
You have
Which, when
to
you put it
wash
like that,
the
is obviously ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's the mentality. And so Darby published pamphlets, and this is another key reason why this era in history was so receptive to new religions, is that by the 1820s, well over half the population were literate. They could read. Up to that point, earlier, it was much harder to transmit a new idea because it had to be done verbally. And also by this time, they had much faster printing presses, and you could print pamphlets and leaflets if you had the money, and distribute them by the tens of thousands. And Darby, by now in his 30s, had inherited a fortune. He was an extremely rich family. And of course, the aristocracy, they never work. The oldest son inherits the estate, and he's got his work cut out, Downton Abbey style, keeping the estate running. But the younger siblings have got nothing to do. So they're turned loose in the world with lots of money. And of course, a lot of them just become playboys and, sail around the world, or, get involved in all sorts of unsavory stuff, just like, wealthy.
Just like today.
Like today. Some of them became explorers, and some of them became scientists, and some of them, you could go into the army, you could be an officer in the army, that was acceptable, but you sure weren't digging potatoes or getting your hands dirty. And so Darby, as the youngest of 6, was turned loose with an enormous sum of money, and he could do just whatever he likes. If he wanted to print 1,000 pamphlets, he just snapped his fingers and there was 1,000 pamphlets. And if he wanted to travel around the world, off he went. Never had any financial worries the whole of his life. So there was the means to spread this new doctrine very rapidly. And of course, not just in Britain, because by this time, it wasn't quite steamships, I don't think, but it was, you could fairly reliably sail across the Atlantic. You could get to Australia. Steamships were starting to come in, and later in Darby's career, he would have been on steamships. And of course, railways were spreading, and so there's really good reasons why all these religions exploded on the world at this point, and why they spread extremely rapidly. Because not only could you send the pamphlets overseas, enormous numbers of people were emigrating from Europe to the New World and taking all this stuff with them. So that's that's kind of the beginning of it. Darby wasn't strictly speaking the founder of the Brethren movement. The Brethren movement happened it actually emerged spontaneously in lots of different places at the same time. People disassociated themselves from all the denominations and started doing their own thing. And Darby kind of hijacked this movement with his radical ideas, and it gave him a ready-made audience.
Right.
So this was Darby was in Dublin at this point, but the Brethren movement was starting to catch fire across the country, and he had a friend called George Vicesimus Wigram, who was the son of a baronet.
Wait, say that name again.
George Vicesimus Wigram.
Wow, that sounds like a character from a book.
It is. It's a very aristocratic movement at this point. It's stuffed with baronets and earls and cousins of royalty and Colonel this, and it's a real kind of Colonel Blimp outfit. And anyway, the reason for the strange middle name of Vicesimus is it's Latin for 20th, and George Wigram was the 20th child of a baronet.
Wow.
Which of course again is very Victorian,
No wonder Elon's trying to have so many children. It's an elitist thing.
I mean, not only did he have 20 kids, he's proud enough of it to actually seal that fact in the child's name. Anyway, Wigram, who was a very close friend of Darby all his life, very closely associated with the movement, and a guy called Benjamin Newton set up a Brethren meeting in Plymouth on the south coast of England. It's a big port city, and a guy called Benjamin Newton. So Wigram and Newton invited Darby to come to Plymouth to help them get the new meeting running there. There was a bit of a revival there. There was a lot of excitement, a bit of hysteria, and that's where the name Plymouth Brethren comes from, because although it wasn't the first Brethren meeting, it was the first one in England,
right?
In civilization. So, and it's not really any brilliant reason for it to be called Plymouth Brethren. It's just that's where it became. That's where it got into the news.
Where it solidified.
The name stuck.
Right.
So they went from being. Because they were not in a denomination, and it was very firmly embedded in their theology that they must not be part of a denomination. They must not take a name. They never called themselves anything. They got called Brethren because they kind of allowed that based on the scriptural year Brethren. And then they got labeled Plymouth Brethren, although they wouldn't call themselves that. So Plymouth is this, Plymouth, that's the Plymouth Brethren movement from then on. And then Darby leaves Plymouth. I think they got about 1,000 followers there. It was quite an exciting thing. And of course, these weren't people that were converted from heathendom. This is what they call sheep stealing. They stole them out of the local churches, and all the local Methodists, Presbyterians, and Anglicans were horrified and sent out lots of pamphlets condemning this new thing that was emptying their churches and their collection dishes at the same time.
There's nothing new under the sun.
No. So Darby then sails off to France and Switzerland and tours all through France and Switzerland, where the whole Brethren movement was catching fire. And he was hugely successful. There was great excitement, and he spent a lot of time in Switzerland, and lots of new Brethren meetings sprang up. But actually, within 50 or 60 years, most of those had disappeared again. It was kind of a flash in the pan, but it kept Darby out of the picture. And in his absence, Benjamin Wills Newton, had kind of seized control of the Plymouth meeting and was putting out some apparently slightly dodgy theology, which is highly technical. And, none of us could ever, you'd have to spend a few days to actually grasp exactly where he was off and exactly on what point. But 1848, I remember Darby's born in 1800, so his age. He's 48. He comes back from Switzerland and finds that Newton has kind of corrupted his shiny new church. And there's a furious argument and dispute between them about the theology. And Darby withdraws from the whole Plymouth assembly. In fact, he splits it. Some people went with Darby and condemned the rest. And so now you've got Newton and his followers in one camp, and you've got Darby and his friends in another camp. And of course, the pamphlets were flying and the getting rich.
It's like social media now.
Yeah, exactly. It was the pamphlet wars were the Twitter of the day. And, you know, prominent people would have massive fights. They would write letters to each other, and then they would publish the letters in pamphlets, and everyone would be waiting for the next pamphlet to come out to see
It's like
what his comeback was, you know. It's all very unseemly and not very Christian.
I agree.
So what happened next was really extraordinary, because there was another big congregation in Bristol, which is another big port city on the south coast. And the kind of most prominent guy there was called George Muller, or Muller. I think it was German in origin. He was a great philanthropist, and he set up these huge orphanages. And if you read his history, he's one of these people that is genuinely a super nice guy. He was very concerned about the social problems of the time. And he, you know, rescued thousands, I think, in his time, of children from the streets and set them up in life. You know, super good guy. And anyway,
that's awesome.
a couple of congregants from the bad Plymouth congregation moved to Bristol, which is like, I don't know, 50, 60 miles away. And George Muller, accepts them into fellowship. And Darby flies off his handle. He says, "You can't accept them into fellowship because they come from they're the bad guys here." And Muller says, "Well, you know, I spoke to them, and they don't actually agree with Newton's bad doctrine. They're not, you know, these guys are clean." And Darby says, no, they're still in fellowship with Newton. And, you know, the whole analogy of COVID, they're going to infect everything. It's a very long and complicated battle that goes backwards and forwards, but essentially, Muller said, "No, this is just extreme. You know, we're not. They're in fellowship with us. It's fine. They're good guys. We check them out." And so Darby utterly refused this, and the whole Brethren movement was split in half. So every Brethren congregation, all the way up and down England and Ireland and Europe, had to take sides in this dispute. Are you with Darby, or are you with George Muller and his, you know, more relaxed, less extreme approach to fellowship? And that division, 1848, was where the Plymouth Brethren movement split into the Open Brethren under George Muller. I mean, he wasn't their leader, but he was the most prominent. And the Exclusive Brethren under Darby. And that was when they were first called Exclusive Brethren at that point. And the thing that's scary about, I mean, one of the distinctions between the Open and the Exclusive Brethren is that the Open Brethren stuck to the original idea that there was no leader except Christ. And the effect of that was each Open Brethren congregation was autonomous. So there was no central government.
It sounds like it wasn't money related either, because a lot of times it seems that it becomes so money important that's the funnel. It turns into this pyramid where all of the money goes to one person. And if you were to spread them out, and also I remember hearing, and you can correct me, that originally the Plymouth Brethren would rotate who would actually speak. They didn't have like one person that was the man. Is that true?
Well, yeah, that's absolutely. I should have made that clear. This idea that they're all equal meant that anyone could get up and speak, as long as you were male, of course. That was
right.
So, yeah, I mean, that was a kind of a positive thing, and you can imagine, as well as people being scared into it, they may have been attracted by the idea that there was the squire who owned his farm, and I'm merely the tenant. But when we go to the Brethren, I can get up and expound on Scripture, and he has to sit there and listen and say amen at the end. So it was this weirdly democratic island in a world where everything else was class-based. But of course, as soon as you got out the door, he was back to being the squire and you were back to being the tenant, right? They
Right.
wouldn't take it beyond the church door. But when you're inside, you're all equal. So the Open Brethren, each congregation is completely independent. So if you're withdrawn from, disfellowshipped in one congregation, if you keep your mouth shut, you can go to the next congregation and they'll welcome you in, because there's no communication unless they want to communicate.
Unless they made a pamphlet.
Well, yes, exactly. And I mean, that's what it is to today. So the Open Brethren movement went on to, there are about 2 million of them now in terms of numbers, but they're very hard to identify because they all kind of took different names. They call themselves, Church Hall this, or the Church of that, or took their name from the street the church was on. So they're very hard to identify because there's no central control. So to pick them out in a census is very difficult, particularly as they still don't like being known as a denomination. It's like, and there's tens of thousands of Open Brethren congregations all around the world, and they're all a tiny little world of their own. They would say, well, we answer directly to God. We have direct communications with God. There's no one between us, which is really the original idea that Darby endorsed. But that's completely incompatible with Darby's other idea of separation from evil, which means you have to keep your finger on every single person in the whole fellowship all around the world, or there might be some bad guy in there who's going to make the apothecary's ointment to stink, is probably how they would have put it.
Right. And that's what Beth was saying, that they even decide who you marry, where you go to school, who you date, everything, where you live.
Oh, yes. Well, you see, this is developed from that original germ of an idea of separation. It's just got more and more and more extreme. So to be clear, at the early stage, before, in Darby's time, if you were withdrawn from, thrown out of fellowship, excommunicated, however you want to put it, you weren't kicked out of your house. You could still eat a meal even with people who were in fellowship. You just couldn't take communion with them. You weren't part of the Brethren Church. I mean, it caused a lot of stress, and a lot of families broke up over it, because the other thing that went along with it was, well, if you're kicked out of the church, you're probably not going to be saved. So, of course, in practice, it broke up a lot of families. But at that point, the church wasn't actually saying you can't live under the same roof or eat at the same table with someone who's not in the Brethren. And in fact, the next leader in the church after Darby was called Raven, and he had 7 or 8 children, I think. And most of his children and his wife never even joined the church. So
it's a
you
big
can see at that point,
between,
it was enforced in church, but it wasn't enforced in the same way in regular life. And what's changed and made it so much worse is that their definition now of separation means you can't do anything. You can't eat, you can't live under the same roof as someone who's left the church, even if they're your mother, your child, your husband, your wife.
Horrifying.
You have to divorce them. You have to kick them out. If they won't move out, you have to move out, and you can't communicate.
Horrendous.
So, but this is the origin of it. It started here, and like so many things in religion, there's almost like a competition to see who can be the most extreme. Because if you take the idea a little bit further, it makes you look a little bit better. And you see this, you see it very clearly in like the Jewish kosher laws, where the most orthodox Jews go to the most ridiculous extremes. They'll take some law about not boiling a calf in its mother's milk to say you can't eat beef and yogurt in the same meal. And they just it's just taking the idea to an extreme. And I think that's a competition, because the most extreme guy in the room appears to be the most righteous. And so it progresses, an evolution of the idea. So where do we get to? So the whole system splits in half, and there's even comes down to physical fights on the steps of the halls, and it gets very public and very ugly. And of course, all the all the other dominions, all the other denominations that had their sheep stolen from them were laughing up their sleeve, watching this wonderful new movement that was the true church and the bride of Christ, and the only people that were going to be saved, slugging it out on the street and hurling the most strongly worded damnations at each other in these very public pamphlet wars. So anyway, that the great split happens, and how much further do we go? I think that's kind of, that gives you the origin of the that's the origin of the Exclusive Brethren. The Exclusive Brethren has now been born in 1848.
Right.
So you get all these conflicting dates. Well, when did the Brethren start? And you get all these different dates, and it depends on whether you mean the Brethren movement, Plymouth Brethren, or the actual Exclusive Brethren. And of course, the Exclusive Brethren developed into, one of the branches. There are lots of people split off at later dates, but there's a continuous chain from that through to the PBCC. Actually, I was wondering if you could put up, there's a picture now. We didn't put up the picture of Darby. You could put up the picture of Darby, and then I think the next picture is a kind of a picture. Yeah, so there's Darby, and you can see he's a formidable character. Yeah, you didn't want to get into an argument with him. Yeah, and he genuinely
he looks like he's ready to fight already.
Yeah. He generally had an amazing intellect, but he was also seemed to be a very cold sort of character. And the reason I say this, and this is actually important in terms of the character of the church, is that the Exclusive Brethren took the view that because the world was about to be destroyed, there's no point in trying to make it any better at all.
Oh, wow.
It's like, why would you polish the brass in a ship that's about to sink? They're all going to die anyway. What does it matter?
Wow.
Well, the Open Brethren, the Open Brethren were very much more public spirited. And as I said, they ran orphanages and they did lots of missionary work. The Brethren didn't do missionary work. They would preach on the street corner in their local town as a kind of a testimony to who they were, and hold out salvation to their local people. But they weren't sending missionaries into Africa and India. They were extremely introverted. And in fact,
I think it's interesting too, because I had never thought about it until you were talking about how cold of a take it is. And really, when you think about it, it's kind of where we are right now, because there's so many evangelicals, there's so many different religions that are pushing towards this end times thing, right? And you're right. I think a lot of people have subconsciously given up and they don't want to shine the brass anymore. And that is such a profound, like what you're saying is so important. And it goes back to what I was asking you earlier. And that is, why is this important to know?
Yes, it's hugely important. I mean, to bring it into its modern context, why would you worry about climate change if the Earth's just about to be destroyed? Why would you worry about running out of resources? We're not going to need them. That's a kind of a modern take on it. But in Victorian times,
very dark and nihilistic.
Yes, that's the word. Because in Victorian times, there were these huge social problems. There was this terrible poverty. There were children. This is when the children, like when you wanted your chimney cleaned, remember the whole of Britain was heated by coal fires with tall chimneys. They would get a 6 or 7-year-old child to climb up and scrub it. And those children all died of horrible cancers from the soot. And some of them just died in the chimney and got stuck there.
Oh my God.
And there was this terrible social injustice. And of course, there was slavery. The British Empire was extremely busy shuttling slaves across the Atlantic. And the thing that kind of shocked me about Darby, and this is why I say he was a pretty cold character, is firstly, he had no problem with slavery at all. In fact, he lamented, he traveled out, later in his life, he travels out to Jamaica. And he laments, he says, since they've emancipated the slaves in Jamaica, they don't want to work in the sugar plantations anymore, and it's ruining the industry.
How rude.
And the other thing that's shocking about him is that, let me find the year. the Great Potato Famine in Ireland, which, you know, I think everyone must have heard of. Let me just pull that up.
Man, I could talk to you for hours. This is fat. Will you come back sometime and just share more? I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, there's lots to say. So yes, 1845. So this is 2 years before the Great Split. 1845, the Great Irish Potato Famine hit Ireland, and this was a disease, a kind of a bacterial or fungal disease that killed potatoes absolutely, and it spread incredibly rapidly, and the whole potato crop was wiped out across Ireland for several years. And this was the only crop they had. This is what they subsisted on, and it killed 1 million people, of these incredibly poor people. 1 million died, and 2 million were forced to emigrate, which is why there's such a population of Irish in the USA. I mean, you know, think of the Kennedys and the Bidens. They were all Irish Catholics. You know, St. Patrick's Day in the USA is a much bigger thing than it is in the UK.
And even in Ireland, because that's what my sister was telling me. She's like, we were there during St. Patrick's Day, and they said it's a bigger deal in the US than it is there.
Yes, exactly. But this was a horrific tragedy, and these were the very people that Darby had spent 2 years serving amongst. And he was an Irishman, and he produced, I don't know, 100, 200 volumes of books and volumes of letters. Everything he said is recorded, and he never once mentioned it. He never even mentioned the Irish potato famine. And that was down to this mentality that they're all going to die anyway. The end is just about to happen. It's not the business of us special Christians to tinker around trying to improve the world. Leave that to God. He's got it all in hand. And if all these people die, that's God's will. And this comes right through very strongly in Exclusive Brethren, and up until 2012, it's in their printed ministry. You don't give to charity. All the money you have is to be kept in the church. And when I was a kid, we never gave to charity. I mean, when they came...
Well, you gave to your own church, though, right?
Oh, our own churches, yes, but not to anything outside of that. I mean,
there's no pity anywhere in the Brethren. No pity. We don't allow pity.
Yeah, my mother was a bit of a rebel. I mean, my parents could push the boundaries a little bit. So when you had a door-to-door collection, you know, selling a little badge or something for cancer care or Red Cross, she would sort of slip me 50 pence and say, you know, go and give it to them. Get one. You know, she wouldn't go to the door. She sent me, so I got a little badge.
Let him get kicked out.
But it was something they did in rebellion. It was not. It was, they weren't supposed to do that. And of course, you know, I mean, this is a whole other podcast, a whole other story. The Brethren in the UK around 2012, they lost their charitable status because the government says, you're not doing anything for anyone else at all. You're just a private club. And to cap it all, you're actually leaving us a trail of damaged and deranged people in your wake that you kicked out and that you will no longer care for. And this is a burden on society. And so the Brethren were in a real corner, and they got a packet mix charity. It was a Just Add Water. They whipped up this charity out of nothing, which they called a Rapid Relief Team. And it was actually a carbon copy of, I think it's Franklin Graham's or Billy Graham charity, which is called the Rapid Response Team. You know, they got all these vans and the sign writing. They whipped up this charity out of nothing, and they suddenly appeared every time there's a charitable event. They had a big burger stall with a big red canopy and big sign writing, and we're really charitable people, and pretended that they'd actually been doing this for the last 200 years. And it's a complete lie.
I love that. And so and they got it back 2 years later?
Yeah, and of course the reason was, if they lose their charitable status, they have to pay tax on all the donations, and it was worth tens of millions of pounds to them. And so it cost them about £1 million a year to run the charity, but they make 10 or 20 times that in terms of retaining their charitable status, which of course is exactly what the Scientologists did, famously, is to get charitable status. And so remove their $1 billion tax bill. But yeah, that's a diversion.
Yeah, no, I love little rabbit trails like that. Sometimes you have to go off on a tangent because, to be honest, I used to be very into charity, and then I realized that it was more of my desire to save people and be the one, that's helping others. And when I really looked at what I was doing, I was enabling people to continue in their state rather than giving them the tools that they needed or the education that they needed or whatever it was that they needed, deliverance, whatever. And so I too have kind of shifted my thoughts about giving charity. Of course not, if somebody's house burns down or, something that's beyond their control, then, that's a little bit different. But, to really try to help people get out of victim status. But keep going with your presentation. I am loving this. Do you want me to keep Darby up, or should we go to a different one?
Yeah, go to the next one, because this sort of brings me on to the next thing.
Okay, am I going in order? Is that right?
Oh no, that's not the right one. It's the long thing. It's number 2. It says leaders.
Oh, I see. You did number them. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So now this is where it gets really culty. Every Brethren house has one of these canvases on the wall with pictures of all the leaders in succession of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. They also have a bookcase which is like full floor to ceiling height and 8 feet wide, which is the size you need to contain all the volumes of writings of these 7 people, and they're all color coded. And that's part of your member. It costs you a hell of a lot of money, but part of your membership is you have these pictures and you have these writings, and you've got everything that all these people have ever written to hand, and those are all intensely indexed, so you can look up any potential problem, anything more or less except the recipe for strawberry jam, and you will find the answer right in there in the writings of these great men, as they're called.
Oh my gosh. It's kind of weird. They look like ghosts,
Well, yes, they do. They kind of tried to make it them all look the same. So starting from Darby, he's on the left as I'm viewing it. You can recognize Darby at one end. So that's Darby, and he, what date did he die? 1882 he died. So he was, he was born in 1800, died in 1882. He hands over to Frederick Raven, who's the guy with the very thick beard.
Right.
Who I'm not sure what time.
And is that decided before they die? Like, did Darby not have children, and they don't have a legacy passed down, or?
Darby never married or had children, which
is
kind of characteristic in a way. He was this. I mean, he may even have been a little autistic, possibly. I mean, I wonder if he was on the spectrum of it.
Right.
Which I am, so I'm kind of sympathetic if that was the case. But so yeah, he didn't. All of these guys believed that the rapture was coming in their lifetime, and they never expected to nominate a successor.
It should be. Here's the 7 guys that have been wrong for how many decades?
So after Darby, you get Frederick Raven, who worked in the Admiralty, also in London. Not an aristocrat strictly, but a very top civil servant in the government. And then you get a big jump, because the next person along is James Taylor, who was born in Ireland but emigrated to the USA. So by the time he took the reins, I think Raven died around 1908, and then James Taylor takes over. But by that time, he's established in New York as a linen merchant. And so the leadership of the Brethren jumps the Atlantic to New York, and then he dies in the late 50s, I think, and his son James Taylor Jr. takes over, who's the guy with the little moustache. He was this was like a family transition. He was the son of the previous leader, which didn't happen before.
Okay,
a new departure. He was very corrupt, and there's all sorts of horrible sex scandals around him, which is again would take several or more we've got a podcast about him. And he really radicalized the whole movement. And then it jumps to the next guy who's called James Symington. And this is another big transition because he lived in a tiny village called Nitchie, North Dakota, a tiny little
Wow.
village right in the middle of nowhere. So we started with, Dublin, London, New York, and then Nitchie, North Dakota, which is a bit of an anomaly. And then the next guy, and now you're coming to the 1980s, late 80s, is John Hales, who was Australian. And then from around 2000, we've got Bruce Hales, who's the current big cheese, who's son of John Hales.
Oh, he looks
He doesn't look nearly that good in real life.
Oh God, he's worse than that. Oh.
So, but in the Brethren, the big irony is that they still, this started out as a movement. The Darby's tract was the notion, the idea of a clergyman is the sin against the Holy Spirit, and you cannot have anyone between your nice grassroots Christians and God. And then they set up this marvelous set of kind of popes who rule the whole thing with an iron rod.
What's wild to me too is they have a huge endowment, right? Don't they have like
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they don't officially get anything, but in reality, because all the Brethren's charitable donation is directed to the church, most of that goes to the leaders, right. Just as straight gifts. And so, we know that Jim Taylor was very wealthy. We know that when Symington died, his will was worth between 20 and 30 million dollars in today's terms. And he was a farmer. I mean, he wasn't independently wealthy. This was the money he had got from the church.
Right.
And Bruce Hales is probably well into $1 billion.
That's what I heard. And it's so
wealthy.
Funny to me that they would say, oh, there should be no one between God and whoever, but I want all the money to funnel up to me.
I don't think the money was really a big deal until, I mean, Jim Taylor got very rich, but I mean, there's two things these people love, and one's power and one's money. And
right. Well, and power gives you, or money gives you power.
In the first half, it was more about the power, and the second half, yes, definitely the power, but the money actually also became a really significant attraction, should we say.
So are they, is Bruce Hale and his little cronies, and they're in Australia still?
Yeah, Sydney, Australia, yeah.
Okay. Are they living like the Dallas megachurch leaders and the Daystar people, and they're jet setting and they've got a billion mansions on the ocean and the whole bit?
Exactly. Yeah. Absolute carbon copy of your USA megabucks, megachurch televangelist guys. Yeah. I mean, the last one to live humbly. I mean, John Hale was the last but one. He was wealthy, but he didn't flash it around. He lived in an ordinary house and drove an ordinary car.
Okay.
Symington, the previous one, even more so, although he was extremely wealthy, he lived in a really old and rundown farmhouse where, the lino on the floor was all scored through from his chair, and no one would have dreamed that he had any money. But under the Bruce Hales,
when did it get so twisted?
Oh, with Bruce Hales.
That's when it went really dark.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was dark long before that, but it was well hidden. But Bruce was just, outrageous materialistic consumerism and flash all your money around. I mean, you might say at least there's a certain integrity in it. He's not hiding what he's doing, but he's also become, as you go along from left to right, they become more and more controlling, more and more authoritarian, more and more extreme,
more separatist.
Yes.
Even though that was Darby's big thing. Okay, so should I go to number 3?
Oh, well, yeah, let's just have a look at number 3. We kind of almost missed that. I'll just comment on that. It's just a nice picture that I really like. So this is a painting by a guy called John Martin. He painted in 1851, which of course is when the Brethren movement was really getting going. And this painting is called The Great Day of His Wrath. And of course it just shows you how even long before we had the what do they call those books by Tim LaHaye?
Left Behind.
Yeah, the Left Behind series. This was the kind of the Left Behind series of the 1850s, and it's a really brilliant picture of the end of the world, and you've got this lightning bolt coming down. Yeah. And if you look at these massive mountains falling on the right, you can see they've actually got little cities on them, and the houses are falling off them as they turn over.
Yeah, you see one right there. Yeah.
Being Victorians who are extremely prudish, and you must never get a glimpse of a woman's ankles, they were equally libertarian in their paintings, and so of course you've got all these unclad ladies tipping into the abyss at the bottom. And this is terrifying stuff. And of course, people in those days went to art galleries to, understand the world. This was their television.
Right.
And so this kind of just gives you a feeling for the state of mind in Britain at this point, as this sense of doom and the impending disaster was spreading through the country. So that kind of covers out that period. So I was going to jump on, and this is really a diversion, to a character called Aleister Crowley.
Yes, this was one of my requests. Thank you for doing this.
And this is really dark in a totally different kind of a way. So in 1887, which was not long before Darby died, or around, Darby dies in 1882. So 1887, not long after Darby's died, early days of Frederick Raven's ministry. Aleister Crowley is a Brethren lad, 12 years old, very wealthy family, as a lot of Brethren were then wealthy families. His father had just died. His father was a very prominent Brethren member who wrote booklets and tracts defending the Brethren's position. As we've been talking about, he was a part of their PR organization, you might say. And he's an only child, and his father had just died of cancer, and he was sent to a boarding school. And by this time, the Brethren had their own boarding schools for boys and for girls. And the school he was sent to was called the Ebor School, and was in Cambridge, Bateman Street, Cambridge. And I grew up in Cambridge, so I'd go past this. It's just a big house, a very big house, big Victorian house. I was familiar with it, but I never knew anything about Aleister Crowley growing up in Cambridge. And the school was run by Mr. Henry Darcy Champney, who was a very prominent member of the Brethren, ministering brother. He wrote lots and lots of hymns, and 4 of them actually made it into the Brethren's hymn book. They still sing them today. And growing up in Cambridge in the Cambridge congregation, Mr. Champney was often referred to in church because he was, the one famous guy, the one guy from the Cambridge congregation who had, made a name for himself among the Brethren generally. So Aleister was very sensitive and very intelligent. And I'm going to kind of read you Aleister Crowley's own account of his experience at this boarding school. So H. Darcy Champney, a leading man in the Exclusive Brethren, had started a school for the Sons of the Brethren at 51 Bateman Street, Cambridge. It was a good enough school from the point of examiners, I dare say. Morally and physically, it was an engine of destruction and corruption. I'm just going to put down a few facts, haphazard as they come to my memory. You may form your own judgment. For instance, a boy named Glasscott, with insane taint, told Mr. Champney that he had visited me, 12 years old, at my mother's house during the holidays. True, so far he had. and found me lying drunk at the bottom of the stairs. My mother never asked me about this, nor was I told of it. I was put into Coventry. Is that a term you use in the USA, sent to Coventry?
Is it? I don't know. It depends. Like, is that like
Yeah.
something like a nunnery or like a seminary?
I don't know what the origin of it. If someone's sent to Coventry, it means they're cancelled, right? You don't talk to
got
them,
it.
right? So it's an old-fashioned English term.
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar.
Yeah. So, what did I get to? Yes, I was put into Coventry, i.e., nor master nor boy might speak to me or I to them. I was fed on bread and water. During play hours, I walked in the schoolroom. During work hours, I walked solitary round and round the playground. So he was isolated from the other kids. He had to work while they were playing, and then he could go out and walk around the playground while they were inside. And he says, I was expected to confess the crime of which I was not only innocent, but unaccused. So Champney hadn't told him what he'd done wrong. He'd dragged him into his office, said, you've done something terribly wicked. We are shunning you. And I expect you'll stay shunned until you come and tell me what it is. And he hasn't even been told what he's done wrong. And it wasn't even true.
Wow.
Which was pretty much my own experience.
I'm so sorry you had that happen to you.
This punishment, which I believe criminal authorities would consider severe on a poisoner, went on for a term and a half.
Wow.
So I don't know how long the terms were, and whether there were 4 terms or 3 terms in a year. But this is several months of complete isolation. He didn't have a father. His mother lived 70 miles away across the country. The only company he had, the only people he saw were the people in the school, and none of them would speak to him, and he wasn't allowed to speak to them.
How cruel.
And he says, the punishment went on for a term and a half. I was, at last, threatened with expulsion for my refusal to confess, and so dreadful a picture of the horrors of expulsion did they paint me. The guilty wretch, shunned by his fellows, slinks on through life to a dishonoured grave, etc., that I actually chose to endure my torture. Physically, I broke down. The strain and misery affected my kidneys, and I had to leave school altogether for 2 years. Now, he was actually very ill indeed. He wasn't expected to live, but he did eventually recover his health. But he was obviously terribly traumatized. He was rescued from the school by an uncle who wasn't in the Brethren, and the uncle took issue with Mr. Champney, and accused him of cruelty. And around the same time, it's not very clear, but it seems like other parents also had issues with the very severe beatings their children were getting, and Champney was Champney resigned, like politicians will suddenly resign, and the vice principal took over the running of the school.
Dang.
Despite all this, it was all hushed up, and Champney remained a highly respected, prominent, leading brother in the Brethren right to the end of his days, and is always regarded inside the Brethren with great affection. Of course, no one in the Brethren has ever heard of Aleister Crowley. But the point I want to take out of this is that, yes, in schools, boarding schools in this era, physical punishment with a cane was commonplace.
Right.
But isolating and shunning someone in this manner is really abnormal. And of course, what it is, it's the Brethren's doctrine of separation.
Right.
And that's how it plays out. And that's how it played out for me and how it played out for Beth. They've been doing this, for this whole time, and they're doing it to a child. And of course, it had a huge effect on him. And so what happened next is that this very sensitive child who had been brought up on the Bible, he was always very fascinated by the book of Revelation. His father was this prominent guy. This is what he said. This is what Crowley writes in his autobiography. The whole business of religion became intolerable. He said, "I did not hate God or Christ, but merely the God and Christ of the people whom I hated."
Wow.
The Christianity of hypocrisy and cruelty was not true Christianity. All his woes came down to one word, sin. He lived in constant fear of it, stood accused and punished in its name, and lived miserably by its avoidance. No more, he concluded, if everybody was so mistaken about God, they could also be wrong about sin. Thus he decided to become a sinner. Not just any
He
sinner.
really did too.
He really did.
He went all the way.
So he decided to become, in his own words, the world's best sinner.
I mean, that is absolutely true.
Yeah. And you can see why. I mean, you can understand why he concluded,
do you know what age he was when he was there at the school?
12. Yeah, he was 12 when this shunning happened. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Aww.
So he I mean, he's still called the world's wickedest man, but he's actually not nearly as wicked as H. Darcy Champney. He led a life which included lots of things that were terribly taboo at the time. He was highly promiscuous, and he did all kinds of weird magic, but he didn't actually do anything illegal. And it was more just he became this complete rebel who was also quite a performance artist. He loved to shock people, and he was really, really good at shocking people. So, in modern terms, he was about as wicked as, let's say, the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. He did drugs, he did all sorts of sexual things that were illegal then but aren't illegal now, and he delved into all kinds of Oriental magic and mystery. And he I mean, you could see his fancy hat. He would set up all these rituals, and when you read it now, it all seems very Harry Potter. I mean, it's basically Harry Potter with a lot of sex thrown in. That's really what
he's an adult Harry Potter.
Yeah, but he was it was all consenting adults. It wasn't satanic or anything like that. He was pursuing ancient Egyptian deities and Hindu deities and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it was all complete mumbo jumbo, and it was also very much a rebellion against everything the Brethren stood for, and everything that the very hypocritical Edwardian society also stood for.
Sure.
He was also very wealthy, only child. His family dies. He inherits all this money. So, like Darby, he could spend the rest of his days doing exactly what he liked. And he was also very intelligent. He went to Cambridge. He was very highly educated. So, just give an account of him. Aleister Crowley, 1875 to 1947. He lived to a good old age. Was an English occultist, mystic, and writer, infamous for his role in developing Thalemia, a religious philosophy centered around, and this was his motto, "Do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law." So what he was really saying is, he's come from this system of oppression where everything you do is controlled and you're told exactly what to do. He says, no, everyone should do exactly what they feel like doing, and that's the only law there is. So it's like original anarchist.
Yeah, that's like the "do as thou wilt" or whatever.
Yeah. So I mean, you can see again, his life was filled with scandal, mysticism, and controversy. He was also a socialite. I mean, if you look at the number of people he interacted with in society, he was friends with a lot of very important and influential people, painters, authors, poets, politicians. He was right in the top of society, which is why he's so scandalous and famous.
Yeah, he was obsessed.
Club, no one would notice.
He was also very obsessed with occult.
Absolutely.
And I remember, because I had done with one of my friends who has a podcast also, we did an entire thing on the witch's hammer. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
Okay, the witch's hammer is this famous book that Montague Summers he interpreted it, because it was from way back when they actually were going after all the witches, and they had like papal permission. Well, that guy became obsessed with strange things. Even on the epitaph of his tombstone, it said, "Tell me strange things."
Yes.
He and Crowley got together because
Yes.
he was obsessed with his kith and kin of either vampires or werewolves or both. I
Yeah.
guess that was something that he was very, very interested in. He had to meet the man, and it's just kind of a wild story.
Yes. Well, Crowley's life is a wild story because
Yeah.
he, as well as
It's so funny because he came
yeah,
from the brethren, it's like,
exactly.
whoa, that's like
I mean, there's an interesting point here that in that when people leave the brethren, they do tend to go on a bit of a bender and try out all the things that they'd been told never to do. And it actually is
which could
sometimes a
be very
problem because
dangerous too.
they're not
That could be dangerous.
streetwise and they don't realize that some of these things there's probably actually there really is a good reason why you couldn't do it. It's not just because it's fun so you shouldn't do it. It's actually might be dangerous. But
Exactly.
no one took it as far as Aleister Crowley.
Right. Well, and
And
then he was also connected to Jack Parsons, who was
that's
one of the
where I'm
founding.
going.
Oh, okay. Well, great.
So
Oh,
yeah,
number 5. Okay, I'll pull it up.
he studied Gnosticism, whatever that is, and he studied Islam. He traveled in Africa. He studied Hinduism. He lectured on yoga, and he studied Buddhism. But he went to all the different countries to study these things and got completely immersed in it. And he studied Taoism and Confucianism, ancient Egyptian religion. He lived in Egypt for a long time. Greek and Roman mystery cults, Norse paganism, and Celtic druidry. And he somehow whipped all these up into this marvelous Harry Potter world and invented his own religion, which he was very serious about. But in busy life, he also found time to be an extremely accomplished and famous mountaineer,
I didn't know that.
and a prize skier, a very accomplished skier and ice skater. So he was this vastly larger than life character. And to make him bigger than that, of course, he loved these fancy costumes. If you see pictures of him in his rituals, he's got these amazing hats and all these accessories, really spooky looking accessories. And
So did that have to do with Thelema, like the religion that he started?
yes, yeah. I mean, he kind of put all this together into Thelema, and then Thelema got merged into another religion or group called the OTO, which I forget what that stands for. Ordo Templo, something or other. It's all fancy names.
Right.
It's performance art, really. So yeah. So
Well, it's all performance art until the demons show up in your bedroom at night, but
well,
I'll let
yeah.
him
I mean,
worry
of course,
about that.
he reckoned he saw and communicated with all these demons and gods and so on. But you have to remember, he was also very heavily into experimenting with all kinds of drugs.
Right.
And kind of one of the reasons he's famous is he was the original counterculture. He was what the Beatles were 50 years before the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles came along and they said, free sex and screw the rules, and I'm not going to cut my hair, and I'm going to go off to India and study with the yoga. We're going to meditate and do lots of drugs and more meditation. And this was what he was doing, because he was doing it in a much less permissive and buttoned up era.
Right.
And of course, the particularly wealthy people in the Edwardian era were notoriously corrupt and promiscuous, but they kept it quiet. Well, he did
had
it
a little bit of
in
conscience
fancy
about
clothes
it.
and wrote very, very explicit poetry around it in large volumes of it and distributed it everywhere. So he was just out to shock everyone.
Sure.
And yeah, so he's the most famous product of the
Right.
exclusive
And so
brethren.
we're still talking about this one.
Yeah, we're still talking about Aleister Crowley.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, he would have been a very interesting guy to be around, but a little scary,
Yeah, for sure.
So just I'm going off on another little tangent. The picture you put up of Parsons, Northrop, and Hubbard. So in let me get you I can never remember dates.
Yeah, take your time.
Yeah, it is.
And I didn't realize that was Northrop.
Yeah, that's Northrop in the middle. Yeah, I'm not sure if I've even got the date. It was the late 40s, mid 1940s.
Okay.
This guy Jack Parsons, who's a very similar character to Crowley in a way, is very deeply into all this witchcraft and occult stuff. So he was kind of Crowley's disciple. He was part of Crowley's church, which was called the OTO at that point. He was in California. He was one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is now part of NASA. And so he was, this is the early stages of rocketry, and he was going around blowing things up. And he was let's see me. Okay, so this Jack Parsons hooked up with a guy called L. Ron Hubbard, who kind of appeared out of nowhere and was also very interested in magic and the occult. And he actually moved in with them. He moved in with Jack and his girlfriend, who was Sarah Northrup. And they practiced all this amazing sex magic together. And they did a ritual, the aim of which was to conceive by immaculate magic conception the great whore of Babylon, who of course is the same character that Darby regarded as representing the Catholic Church. I mean, this is all imagery out of the book of Revelation. And I meant to mention as well that Crowley also named himself, his own name for himself was the Beast 666.
Yes, that's right. I forgot about that too.
Yes. So, yeah, again, it's imagery out of Revelation. So, I mean, it's almost like Stranger Things. It's almost like Crowley was like the dark underworld, the upside down world of J.N. Darby. They both got their inspiration out of Revelation and all that fantastic imagery of beasts and dragons, but Crowley took it in a different direction. So
wasn't he also trying to get like a homunculus, or I forgot to say how they say that, to like
they also, Parsons also did another ritual, the intention of which, so he thought he had managed to produce the great whore of Babylon. Some red-haired woman appeared in his life. He decides that this is his answer to his magic ritual, and he then gets together with her and tries to conceive the man of sin, which of course is another thing out of Revelation.
Gosh, why would anyone try to do that?
Yes.
Good Lord.
And then Hubbard steals Jack Parsons' girlfriend, elopes, runs off with her, and also steals a very large quantity of Jack Parsons' money, disappears off the scene, flees off the scene, and early in the 1950s, a few years later, he then founds the Church of Scientology.
Right.
So that's your
connection. And somebody was saying in the chat that we need to do another thing just on the connection between the Brethren and Scientology.
Yes. Well, of course, there would be some tiny transmission of scraps of ideas through that very long chain, but there's not really a connection in that sense. The real connection between the Brethren and Scientology is they have exactly the same method of dealing with people who leave the church, who leave the cult, which is that they hire private investigators and they do all sorts of mean and sneaky things, and they follow you around. And particularly if you speak out against the Brethren or you speak out against Scientology, there's pretty much nothing they won't do to shut you up. That's really the way it's governed, by this one very overruling figure at the top, and everyone very controlled and oppressed, is exactly the same. You can like map L. Ron Hubbard straight onto Bruce D. Hales.
Got it.
And of course the money.
And so, but isn't Scientology a little bit more, and this could just be my imagination, aren't they just a little bit more dark about how they go after people later? Well, I mean, haven't there been murders with them?
Yes, Scientology has actually murdered people, but I firmly believe that the Brethren would do that if they could get away with it, because it's religious hatred, and we know what religious hatred leads to. I mean, it leads to suicide bombers, and believe me, when they hate, they hate.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, sort of coming on to probably coming on to slightly less
So L.
areas.
Ron Hubbard steals Jack Parsons' girlfriend,
Yes,
wife, whatever, and
yeah,
all of like a good portion of money from him.
yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, if you're thinking of joining up Scientology, take a little look at the where it originates from. As we were saying, it might give you second thoughts.
Yeah.
L. Ron Hubbard is a extremely unpleasant and unsavory character. He makes Crowley look like a saint. Um, yes. So I haven't. I'm not really wanting. I haven't got anything more on Scientology really than that.
Okay. Okay.
It was just an interesting connection.
Yeah, no, it's a great
Funny
tangent. I love
thread.
it. It's so fascinating how so many of these characters all knew each other too.
Yes, yeah. It was kind of a small world even then, wasn't it? Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So do you want me to go to the next one?
Let's see what the
Or
next
not
one
yet?
is.
We're on 5.
Yeah. I think it's time to move on.
Okay. So we'll go to 6.
So here we come on to this is we went up a side road and then we've come back along and we got back onto like mainstream Brethren. So there's nothing to do with Crowley. This is Plymouth Brethren.
This is back to Darcy.
Darby's dispensation.
Or Darby. So let's go back and say, okay, this is the man that influenced this man.
Exactly. So this is Sarah Scofield, who he's not in himself a particularly important person. He was kind of used by other people. What he did was he took Darby's dispensationalism and rapture theory in particular, and eschatology, end times ideas, and he put them into an edition of the Bible where there was on each page of the Bible, there was a whole set of notes explaining the context of that page of the Bible and of those verses, explaining them in terms of dispensationalism and in terms of Darby's understanding of the prophecy and of the end times. And this was in Sarah Scofield was born in 1843 and he died in 1921. And he had a very dodgy career in the early part of his life. He managed to get in with a politician and become the Attorney General of Kentucky, was it? One of the states. And then a whole load of forgery and bribery was brought up against him and he was put in prison.
Oh, I never knew that.
Yeah, he had a very dodgy career. And then he kind of disappears out of there and reappears in, I forget, where maybe it was Texas. He fled the scene of his crime.
I think it was Texas.
Yes. He abandoned his wife and children.
Lovely.
And kind of magically reappears as a pastor in some church in Texas. And he's obviously a very clever guy. He's obviously very intellectual, but he's also very shifty. And he manages to marry himself to the pastor's daughter in this church, or one of the leading people's daughter, and so he integrates himself into this little congregation without telling them that he's actually got a wife back home. I mean, they did divorce just before he remarried, but no one knew anything about this other family he had. And he was working closely with a friend of J.N. Darby's, a guy that Darby had visited, because Darby traveled extensively. He visited the USA and Canada, I think, about 5 times. He visited the Caribbean, Australia, and New Zealand in spreading all this stuff. And he took on board and studied and learned all about Darby's dispensation and rapture theory. And then he had this idea, which was actually a very clever idea, of producing a Bible that had all these notes in it actually printed on the page, so that as you read through the Bible, you got the commentary that told you what it meant.
And it was the very first one ever.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Up to then there were commentaries, but it was a separate book.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So he was the first one that published it page by page.
Yeah.
Got
It
it.
was kind of a little bit like, the For Dummies series. Someone had this brilliant idea of doing For Dummies. This is like the Bible for dummies.
Hey,
Um,
don't make fun of it. That's how I learned to play chess.
I'm not making fun of it. Yeah, but it's for dummies, and it's a guide for the rest of us. So we all come into the rest of us category, right? Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So if you look at this, this is like the cover page of the Scofield Reference Bible he published, and it says the Reverend C.I. Scofield, D.D., which stands for Doctor of Divinity, which is a university degree in theology or whatever. Because he never was a D.D., and he probably had some qualifications as a lawyer, but he styled himself as the Reverend Doctor of
Right.
Divinity, and so this is rather typical of his very shifty. He was a con man, basically.
He was a fraud.
He was a fraud, yeah. But the stuff
But
he put in the Bible wasn't his own. Sorry, go on, yeah.
Yeah, wasn't he also kind of a patsy in a way for the Rothschilds? Because
Oh yes. Well,
yeah,
that's what I was going to say. He had this idea. It's probably his idea to do this, and then we get on the whole subject of Zionism. So, this is really hard to understand. I've got quite a lot of questions about how this works. But one thing about evangelical Christianity in the USA, the ones that embrace this dispensationalism,
yep,
is that they are fiercely, almost fanatically pro-Israel.
yes,
And
and
this
it's
is
because of this Bible.
and it's because of this Bible, and it's because of Darby's interpretation. And so just to kind of clarify that, I'm going to just kind of run through what the Bible, according to Darby, and I'm agnostic about it. I don't have any opinion about what the Book of Revelation means. I'm just telling you this is what the Scofield Bible, which is just a reprint and a little bit of exaggeration on Darby's dispensationalism. This is what it says is going to happen at the end of the world. So first there's the rapture. And all the saints, all the saved people are gone. They literally go through the ceiling. And then there is a 7 years of tribulation. So there's great suffering and upheaval on the earth, including natural disasters, wars, and persecution. There's the rise of the Antichrist, who is a political and religious leader who will establish control over much of the world, including Israel. Okay. And then there's the sealing of 144,000 Jews. So out of all the Jews, which is at the moment, well, it's like 15 million or something, only 144,000 are sealed, which means they're the only ones that are going to be saved. All the rest are going to be slaughtered in these great tribulations.
And don't they say it's going to be like 144,000 boys?
I don't know. I mean, that's not in Darby.
Okay.
I don't think, but there's all sorts of different themes and variations, and some say, well, no, it'll be 1/3 of the Jews. But however you calculate it,
Right.
Numerically, it's going to be worse than the Holocaust, much
Right.
worse. They're nearly all going to die. And then you get the Great Battle of Armageddon, which is this vast battle where the Antichrist has entered into the temple, and then Christ returns from heaven with the saints, and they have this enormous battle, and the blood runs so deep it comes up to the bits of the horses, and all this, really, really gruesome stuff. And then these 144,000 Jews are kind of converted to Christianity or own the Christ that they reject as their savior, and so they're saved. All the rest are not. And then Christ is reigning in Jerusalem, and then that's the millennium, and that's the sort of 1,000 years where everything's lovely. So the reason that evangelicals, dispensationalists supported the establishment of the state of Israel, and the reason they defend Israel so fiercely, there's a number of reasons, but the first one is that the rapture can't come until the Jews have returned to Israel. So back in Scofield's time, the Jews were not in Israel. They wanted to go back, but there wasn't the political will to make it happen. I think the British more or less controlled the area, and they weren't letting them in. And so along with this dispensation theory came a movement to let's allow the Jews to go back, let's make a nation for them, because that will bring the rapture on, so we can all be blessed and go to heaven instead of living in our smoky, dirty Victorian cities.
We don't want to polish our brass.
Yeah, exactly. We can go. And so that was a kind of a really selfish reason. But the other reason was that there was, of course, huge conflict, because remember, even now, only about 20% of Christians worldwide believe this dispensationalism.
Right.
Like about 75% are still on the other story, which is the church is going to keep expanding and bring blessing to the whole earth,
Right.
and all the tribulations are done. So there was a huge arguments and fights and pamphlet wars about whether this dispensational theory was true. And there was this kind of feeling, well, if the Jews actually go back, that'll prove we're right, because then the prophecy will be fulfilled, which is a really backwards way of putting it. Because,
Right.
to prophesy something and then make it happen and then say, well, that proves we were right, is kind of backwards.
It absolutely is. And it also, and I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, but from what I understand, when the Scofield Bible was first written, there was, like a half a page of notes about that one strip of land being the promise. It is promised to the Jews, period, where it didn't actually say forever until this Bible. Were you going to talk about that?
Yes, exactly. So what happened was Scofield had this idea, but because he didn't have the money, printing Bibles is expensive, but he had a number of sponsors, some of which were very prominent Jewish Zionists. So these were the Jews who wanted to go back to Israel for their own, it was their country,
Sure.
it was Jerusalem. They didn't think they were going to go back to get slaughtered. They thought they were going to go back and establish their, it's their homeland.
Right.
But so there was a guy called Samuel Untermeyer, who was from a very prominent Jewish lawyer, very wealthy, who and no one's quite sure. You can't put a certainty on this, but Scofield obviously got a hell of a lot of money from somewhere to print this Bible.
Oh, it came from the Rothschilds, I thought.
And then others say, well, I mean, according to the sources I've looked at,
you haven't found
you can't prove it was the Rothschilds, but he was closely associated with the Rothschilds, who of course it's the byword for wealth. I mean, Rothschild wealth. So they could easily have done it, and he was associated with them. And they were very strong Zionists. And then there were also some Christian Zionists who he associated with, who were wealthy. So, I mean, the facts are he got lots of money, and when the Bible was printed, the notes were basically Darby, but with a very heavy emphasis on the Zionist thing, which said, and they also kind of used a scripture from much earlier in the Bible, which says that I'll bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you. And they kind of said, well, this means that any nation that supports the Jews will be blessed by God for doing that, and any nation that's against the Jews will be cursed by God for doing that. So there was a third motive, which is, well, if we help the Jews out, God's going to bless us.
Exactly. And there's a lot of people that believe that.
Yes.
And do you know, like, over time, the Scofield Bible ended up getting 15 pages rather than just a half a page on this whole land thing?
Yes.
Crazy.
Well, I'm not surprised. But the other interesting thing about the Scofield Bible is that the first edition was published just before the First World War, and the second edition, which had extra notes and Zionist stuff, was published just after the First World War. So, like we were saying before, when things look rosy, people have an optimistic outlook. But of course, at this period, just after the First World War, it really did feel like the world was going to end. I mean, they called it the war to end all wars. And so this really boosted, this was kind of in people's mind, well, this proves that this dispensationalism, this very negative black outlook, is true, and the world really is going to end. So, like, we better sign up for this. And
I mean, this is literally, I think, the theme of the night. If we can somehow keep the world from convincing us that it's doomsday and that we're somehow participating in the consciousness of this. And I don't know. And it makes me sad because I do think Christians are amazing people, but I also think that they've been hoodwinked.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's still very much USA Bible Belt. I mean, the rest of the world. I mean, if you went into a street in England or Germany or anywhere Europe or even Canada and said, "What's the rapture?" They'd say, "What's that? Is that Justin Bieber's latest single, or is that a new kind of fizzy drink?" I mean, they've never heard of it, right? And yet, for those of us that were brought up in this theory, we thought that's what the Bible actually said. And we
Right.
never even conceived. I mean, it wasn't until well after I'd left the Brethren that I realized there were different interpretations of that passage of scripture. And,
Right.
I'm not saying that this is right or that is the right interpretation. I haven't got the foggiest
Right.
idea
We're
what it
just
is.
talking about the history here.
I mean,
But
if
it
you
was
went back and spoke to St. John on Patmos and showed him all this stuff, said, "No, I didn't mean that at all, and it's probably meant something totally different."
right. Well, that's why there are
That
so
was
many
my notes for a
contradictions.
play I was writing for the local theatre. That wasn't meant to be in the Bible.
That's so funny. That would be funny. And then the fact that it was the first American author that was published by Oxford was a huge deal.
Exactly, and this, of course, is the final interesting twist to the story. I mean, you could talk about Zionism.
Right.
Yeah, you can talk a lot about Zionism. The thing that puzzles me about Zionism, or the question I have in my mind, is: do the evangelicals who enthusiastically give hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel every year, and there's evangelicals who actually go out and scour places like Russia and Eastern Europe and find Jews and pay them to move back to Israel. What is their motive? Do they realize that according to their Scofield Bible, they're actually taking these people back to Israel to be slaughtered just so that those Christians can benefit by
So that they
bringing the
can get their
rapture on us?
rapture moment. It's crazy,
Do they
right?
think of it like that, or is it all just a bit woolly in their head and they just think this, it's prophesied in the Bible, so we should make it happen?
I
And
think that's the bigger
yeah,
thing. I think a lot of people don't even think to that second level.
yes, yeah. I mean, Darby, to be honest, Darby wasn't a Zionist. He had no interest in the political world at all, as long as it never changed and the
Right.
aristocrats stayed in power. He didn't campaign for Jews to go back to Israel. It was so when we talked about those three things that are the three main threads of Brethrenism, there's the separation. Well, that didn't even last Brethrenism. Only one half of Brethrenism kept the big separation deal. There was the church structure. Well, I mean, the Brethren, the open Brethren still have that church structure. The exclusive Brethren pretend they do, but of course, in reality, they don't. So that all stayed in the cult. But the rapture doctrine was its great export. I mean, all these people today, vast
Oh,
majority of
yeah.
people who believe this, they're not brethren.
Right.
It was just a really powerful idea that leaked out of the Brethren system and infected this whole swathe of the USA.
All because a guy fell off a horse.
I know. I mean, this is, they talk about the butterfly effect. They say, well, a
Right.
butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon and it can cause a hurricane in the Caribbean or something.
Right.
So if the horse had thrown him a little harder and finished him off, or if the horse had missed the gatepost and he landed in a big wet puddle, there might not be a state of Israel. And also, considering the incredible influence of the evangelical lobby, you might even have a female president in the United States today.
Right.
But then I wouldn't be sitting here to tell you about it because I've
Right.
never been in the awful PVCC. So it's
Well, I'm glad
yeah,
you're here, and thank you so much, and I can't believe it's already been 2 hours. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
yeah.
Thank you. And then there's one more photo. Should I pull that one up?
I
Or
forget
are
what
you
it is.
done? Are you done with the
But there's just one comment. There's just
Okay.
one interesting tiny twist, and that is Scofield travels to England to meet the publisher at the Oxford University Press, which is the most prestigious printing operation in the world. He's a guy called Henry Frode, Frowde, and he's a fully paid up member of the Exclusive Brethren. And in fact, the James Taylor, who was the leader at that time, used to stay with Henry Frode in London when he went to the UK. So whether there's any significance in that, I don't
Wow,
know.
no, I
But the
never
fact is,
knew
the actual
that part.
publisher, whose name I think is in the Bible, here he is, Exclusive Brethren. So
Oh
yeah,
my gosh. Didn't even know that part.
that's your final twist. Yeah.
That's a good one. Oh my god.
So yeah, the last picture is kind of, I put it in to kind of couple with the, you know, the great day of his wrath. So this is the Left Behind, the poster for the Left Behind movie with Nick Cage, and of course it, you know, the orange glow and the destruction. It's the great day of his wrath all over again. So it brings the whole apocalyptic disaster, negative, everything's going to shit mentality right up to date. And of course, the Left Behind books sold like 50 or 60 million
it was
copies.
insane.
It's
And I
insane,
do
yeah.
believe that it was propaganda. I really do. I believe it
Oh,
was
yes.
absolutely for a reason to solidify Christians in their support for certain things.
Yeah.
Wild. Wow. Thank you. That was amazing. I'm gonna
Yeah,
put
no,
I'm
you're
gonna
very welcome.
I'm gonna get rid of these. How do I stop sharing? I don't even know how to get rid of it. Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Remove from stage. There we are.
And just to put in a little puff for our Get a Life podcast.
Oh yes, I was
if
gonna.
you want to learn more about the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, look up Get a Life podcast. It's on YouTube and Spotify and everywhere, and it's all interviews with survivors and escapees, plus a lot of really interesting stuff and dirt on the people.
I love it. I
have
love it. I do. And what's so fascinating to me is how they're all connected. Like Crowley knew Darby, and you know all the. I'm not Darby. Who the Scientologist one?
Yeah, Hubbard.
Yeah.
Yes,
And it's just, and then Parsons, and like how they all knew each other. But then the guy that wrote The Witch's Hammer interpreted it. He knew him, and it's just it's so wild to me
yeah,
how they all find each other.
yes, yeah. It is amazing. You start digging through history, and these really strange coincidences turn up where people meet that have some other connection that seems totally unrelated.
Yeah, and if somebody would have said to me, "Who's running Oxford Press when Scofield goes there?" I would never have guessed it would have been a Brethren. Like literally the last thing I would have guessed.
Yeah. I mean, the other little twist is that Ebor school, which is the one where
Crowley went as a kid.
Crowley went to, James Taylor, who like the leader of the Brethren, sent his son William there as well. So
Wow.
the Taylors had
And
that.
so Taylor was what, the fourth? Oh wait, the third and fourth.
Taylor Senior was the third, and Taylor Junior was the fourth.
The fourth, the
And of
mustache.
course, Taylor Junior was a whole big scandal all of his own, but there's not time for that now.
Yeah. One of the people, Kathy in the chat was saying that she said, here, I'm gonna post it. It's funny. Oh my God, we were antiquing today and I saw that exact picture, and it was the picture of all of them. So that means somebody must have left the group.
How funny. Wow.
I know.
That's really weird.
So anytime somebody gives up one of those and they leave the Brethren, they should take that painting or picture and write on the back of it like what their name was, who they were with, and then go ahead and give it away.
Well, I would put it in the pantry because it would scare all the mice out.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. Well, thank you so much. And then do you directly work with people at all, or do you just lead people to the podcast? Because I did put a link to the podcast in the description box of.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want me to add to that?
No, not really. I mean, if you go to the podcast, you'll find all our contact. And yeah, we do help people who are trying to get out, and we're in the process of setting up a charity so we can do that more effectively. Yeah, no, I mean, we're always glad to hear from people.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. Is there any last things that you wanted to mention before we go?
Yeah, I'd like a cup of tea, please.
Well, you go make yourself some tea because I can't deliver as far
Yeah.
as you are.
Yeah.
I don't deliver to Canada.
Yeah. There's
Have
probably a tariff on it by now anyway. So
right, exactly. I know I'm gonna go have some hot cocoa myself.
yeah, that's
So
good.
have a wonderful evening, and thank you anyone that came. This is the kind of stuff I love to learn. It's just so fun. I appreciate you very much.
Yeah.
And I would love to have you back. All
Yep.
right, everybody have a wonderful